Mark chapter 2. And we're going to be looking this morning at how Jesus interacts with the Sabbath and people's views of the Sabbath. So this is Mark chapter 2, reading from verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what Jesus did?" No, they wouldn't have read what Jesus did, would they? Start again. He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. So here's Jesus. He's out for a stroll, nice sunny Sabbath afternoon maybe, and he's out for a stroll, a nice walk through the fields with his disciples. And they're walking along, picking grains in their hands and eating them, which was a thing that was allowed in Israel. You could walk through the fields and you could pick stalks of grain as long as you didn't kind of like do wholesale harvesting or damage the fields in the process. And they were just having a nice time walking along, having a little snack, chatting, enjoying the sunshine, enjoying each other's company, and casually breaking the law. Not the Roman law, the Romans weren't bothered, not the Old Testament law, but rather the rabbinical law, the law of the rabbis that had begun to, over the years and the centuries, to put some restrictions around what could and couldn't happen on a Sabbath. So on a Sabbath day, you were allowed to walk 1,999 steps. So if you've got a fitness tracker or a smartwatch, and you get that nice little buzz to tell you how many steps you've done. Mine kind of buzzes and it flashes with, "Wow, you've completed 10,000 steps." Well, if Jesus and the disciples had been wearing one of these, it would be, you've completed 2,000 steps. And presumably, what Jesus should have been doing was allocating somebody who was good at counting, so maybe Matthew, to say, let us know when we've walked 999 steps so we can then walk back and be safe. I suspect he wasn't doing that. I suspect they were just walking and relaxing. We don't know if they broke this particular Sabbath law. Probably they did. But they certainly broke the Sabbath law that says you must not harvest on a Sabbath. Because when a grain, a head of grain was plucked, that was considered to be harvesting. And if one of Jesus' disciples then got that head of grain and rubbed it in his hands so that he could pluck out the bits to eat, that was counted as threshing. And so that would have been work on the Sabbath. So according to these rules, Jesus and his disciples should have stayed at home eating their pre-prepared Sabbath snacks. And the Pharisees, the religion police, turn on their blue lights and they pull Jesus over for breaking the Sabbath law. And it's easy to paint them as killjoys. But for them, they saw this as something really crucial. They saw that God's blessing came through the keeping of the law, and that law needed to be hedged. It needed to be guarded with extra rules just to make sure that no one was in any danger of breaking the law. And their identity as people of Israel, their identity as people of God was very much tied up in three things: in the temple and the land and the Sabbath. And the Sabbath had such an important role for them that observing the Sabbath was what helped to identify them as the people of God. Now, the Sabbath, of course, was given by God in the Ten Commandments. We're told that we are to keep the Sabbath day holy and not to work on it. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, we read this: "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." So a big part of what was going on for the people of Israel was this remembrance that they had been slaves in Egypt. And as slaves, they didn't get a day off. They just had to work day after day after day. And they came out, and after so many years of slave mentality, it kind of gets inside you, and maybe even when you're free, you still act as someone who is enslaved. It's a danger for all of us in different ways. And God gave them this gracious command to say, no, you must stop. You must remember that who you are is not the sum of your production. And he gives them this gift and says, you're not to work. Your workers aren't to work. Your land isn't to work. And you've got this rhythm of 1 day in 7 to rest. The Pharisees, the Sabbath police, had forgotten the true source of their identity. They saw their identity in the temple and the land and the Sabbath, but they forgot that the true source of their identity was in the Lord who called them to rest and freedom and joy. And God calls us into rest, not into slavery. We are not to be defined by what we produce. And the Bible gives us this spacious command, and it gives a few pointers of what obeying the Sabbath looks like, but it doesn't kind of button down every single aspect of it, because it's intended as a law, as a gift of God's grace. But over the years, over the centuries, people would ask, well, what exactly does it look like to keep the Sabbath? What does that mean? And And there's something in human nature that says, if I know which boxes I can tick off, which things I do in my religious observation, how long do I need to have my quiet time in the morning? How long do I need to pray for? What things do I need to do in order to be feeling that I am right with God? And it becomes this kind of self-righteousness. So by the time of Jesus, there were 39 categories of work to be avoided on the Sabbath. And under each of these categories, there were lists of things that were to be avoided. These 39 categories are still to be found today in Orthodox Judaism. So there were all sorts of things like you weren't allowed to untie a knot on the Sabbath. If you were wearing a garment and the garment tore, and maybe you want to sew it up to stop it from tearing further or to protect your modesty, you're allowed to put one stitch in the garment, but two would be work. You were allowed to write one letter, but two would be work. You could give medical assistance, first aid, if somebody's life was threatened. But say if a building collapses, you would be allowed on the Sabbath to dig down to find somebody whose life was threatened. And if their life was threatened, you could pull them out. If their life wasn't threatened, you had to leave them there until the next day. If you found a corpse, you had to leave it there until the next day. And this had kind of developed over time. Each generation had added more and more of a hedge, a fence around the law to protect them. And so here's Jesus and his disciples out on a pleasant non-step counting stroll, harvesting and threshing on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees arrive, blue lights flashing, sirens going. Have you ever been pulled over by the police? Yeah, interesting mix of reactions. Yeah, the last time I was pulled over by the police was on Glen Crutchery Road, and there was. I saw a police car coming the other way, and then in my rear view mirror, I saw it stop and do a U-turn, and I thought, this probably isn't a good sign. And then the blue lights start, and then the siren starts, and it's the weirdest feeling, even when you know that you've done nothing wrong, or as far as you know, you've done nothing wrong. You know, the heart starts to beat a bit faster, and in that moment, I was ever so polite. Yes, officer. Sorry, officer. I'll get that rear light sorted first thing in the morning, officer. So Jesus and his disciples are pulled over for Sabbath violations, and you're not getting the sense from Jesus of a polite, yes, officer, it's a fair cop. Instead, he decides to start to quote their police rule book to them. And says, have you never heard? Have you never heard of David and his men in the time of Abiathar and how they ate this showbread that only the priests were allowed to eat? Now, David was their most revered king. And Jesus was here as the son of David, the one who was the descendant of David and greater than David. And he was claiming audaciously a right over the law. He wasn't even arguing here whether their silly little extra laws were really anything to do with God's law. He was doing something deeper. And claiming this right over the law. And then he says, well, Sabbath is made for people, not people for the Sabbath. Sabbath is God's gift for rest and freedom. Now, I think today, our particular problem in church here this morning is not a kind of Sabbatarian legalism. You know, it's not like you used to get in the Western Isles of Scotland, where the swings would be locked up, padlocked on the Sunday, just in case somebody broke the Sabbath law. I don't get the feel that that's kind of where we're at. I think we've swung actually too far the other way, and we have thrown out the Sabbath baby with the legalism bathwater. And you need, and I need, a weekly Sabbath. For years, for me, it was a Sunday, and I think the Lord's Day is the best day for your Sabbath, if at all possible. Now, for me, Sunday doesn't work so well, and so I have a Wednesday. And there are occasions when that day might need to change to a different day every once in a while, but really important. I remember a discussion with another minister a little while ago, and he was saying, kind of proudly, that he never had a day off. He's just always too busy. And you see, God doesn't want us to be defined by our production. And I was gently challenging him on this, and he said, well, the devil never takes a day off. And I said, well, maybe that's not the best role model for you. Just saying. But Sabbath is a gift for us. And I think it's a spiritual practice that we do need to recover. And it reminds us of who we are and the blessings that God gives us. It's his invitation to see ourselves and to define ourselves differently. You know, without that kind of circuit breaker in the week, I think there's a real danger that we get caught up in our own self-importance. I remember William Wilberforce, who was so instrumental in abolishing slavery in the 19th century. A group of MPs had come to him and asked if he would put himself forward to be party leader and prime minister, and he said, let me have a Sabbath first. And he wrote in his diary subsequently that having had the Sabbath and that space to rest, he could see that would have been something that was about his self-importance, but not God's calling, God's best on his life. And there are so many ways in which we fail to have perspective if we just keep on keeping on and not stopping, not making that space for rest and worship and remembering who we really are. And so Jesus here says Sabbath is made for people, not people for the Sabbath. And he says that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. So it's not about the externals of all these regulations and rules and laws. It's about him. And Sabbath goes all the way back to Exodus, to God's commands to the people coming out of slavery, but it's something even more than that. It goes right back to creation in Genesis. And God created the heavens and the earth, and then at the end of 6 days, on the seventh day, he'd completed his work. He said it was very good, and he rested. Jesus, the second person of the Trinity involved in creation, was here saying, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I am the Lord who rests and invites you into my rest. Sabbath is a day to rest from work. Maybe there are things that you obsess over that you must do every day, and perhaps for some of us, you need that day a week just to lay that down. Jesus said in the Gospels that he came not to abolish the law, not to take away even a stroke from God's law, not from all the silly extra rules, not to take a stroke away from that. He didn't abolish the Ten Commandments. He came to fulfill the law. And he tells us that law is summed up in love God with all you've got and love your neighbor as yourself. And if you do these things, then you do fulfill the law. And this is the heart of it, that as we have God's love poured into our hearts, and by his Spirit, that love is constantly like a river pouring into us and out from us in love for God and neighbor. That love will lead us to want to keep God's law, the Sabbath, and actually every aspect of God's law. Stealing, envy, adultery, everything. Because of love. Every law that is just an external becomes legalism, becomes death, becomes self-righteousness. It's only the law that is written on our hearts that becomes for us life. And Jesus, as the Lord of the Sabbath, is inviting us to rediscover that life. He comes to show you the way back to him, to invite you to rediscover the steps of the dance. And Jesus doesn't just say it, he then goes on to show that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. Another Sabbath, he's in the synagogue, as was Jesus' custom on the Sabbath. And there was a man there, we read, who had a shriveled hand. And there was kind of a sense of maybe a little bit of a setup going on, because there were people who were there already watching, wanting to know if Jesus would heal this man on the Sabbath. The Sabbath police were there, notebooks ready, pencils sharpened. There was already some damning stuff in the notebook from when Jesus had claims to forgive a man's sin before he raised him up to walk. And Jesus sees the man. Do you know, I feel a bit sorry for this guy, because, you know, if I was him, I'm not sure I would want to be Exhibit A in a tussle between Jesus and the Pharisees. But they're all watching him, and Jesus says to the man, "Come out here, right out front. That's it. Show us your hand." And maybe he didn't really want to be the center of attention, but he wanted what Jesus had for him more. And it's important to recognize that what Jesus has for us, we mustn't let anything get in the way of it. And so Jesus says, is it lawful? Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? And they maintain this stony silence, and this emotion rises up in Jesus. We're told that he's angry. The word really means furious. You can see the fire in his eyes, and he's deeply distressed. There's a grief at the stubbornness of hearts that that want to just tick the boxes of religion instead of seeing people set free. And we are called to be the community, the people of Jesus who are in his business of setting people free. Religion gets in the way sometimes of Jesus' way of rest and freedom. And it's tempting when you read the Gospels, and it's tempting in this story to make the Pharisees kind of the pantomime baddies. You know, boo! Bad Pharisees! But when we do, we are maybe in danger of the same self-righteousness as the Pharisees. You know, now we're not going about, most of us, catching people on Sabbath infractions. But any time you pass judgment on another person in your heart, then that's a self-righteousness that is really no different at roots to the self-righteousness of the Pharisees. Don't get me wrong, there are times to point out someone's sin because of love for them. But judgment belongs to God and to God alone. And so Jesus says to the man, stretch out your hand. And now for him it's double or nothing. And Jesus heals his hand, and it's as good as the other hand. It's fully back to normal, and now he can look normal. He can do stuff with two hands. He can work. He can be less of a burden on his family. He can take his normal place in the community. Jesus is in the business of healing. And we need to remember that today, that Jesus is alive and well and in the business of healing. And so the Pharisees immediately, it's one of Mark's favorite words, immediately the Pharisees, seeing what Jesus had done, got up and praised the Lord for this outstanding miracle. No, the Pharisees immediately went out and looked for the Herodians. So this was people who were kind of cozying up to the Roman power of the day. Unlikely bedfellows for the Pharisees, but they were driven in desperation to it. Looked for the Herodians to plot to kill Jesus. I wonder if in their big list of things that counted as work that you shouldn't do on the Sabbath, I wonder if plotting to kill someone was maybe on that list, or maybe they hadn't thought of that one. 79 verses into Mark's Gospel, and people are plotting to kill Jesus, little knowing that Jesus is plotting to die on a cross, to take on himself not just Sabbath infractions, but every way in which we have been self-righteous, self-focused, concerned about following what we want instead of Jesus' lordship. Jesus plotted to die so that we can enter into his rest and his freedom. And Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath, says, come to me, and I will give you rest. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. He says, come to me, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Jesus came to invite us into this rest. He is our ultimate Sabbath rest. And he says, come to me and let your identity be shaped not by what you do, but by who you are in me. Child of God, forgiven, loved, accepted, honored, cherished. He says, come to me and let your work bring you dignity but not slavery. He says, come to me and let go of that script that goes round in your head that says, I must be productive on all occasions, at all times. I need to be productive in order to prove to myself or to others my worth. Let go of that and rest instead, he says, in my finished work on the cross. Jesus says, come to me and let go of the self-righteous notion that if you can live a good enough life, that if you can tick enough boxes and do enough right things, then you will be right with God and be justified in feeling good about yourself. He says, instead, see that on the cross, that I took all of your self-righteousness and all of your sins and all of your failings, and I exchanged all of that for my righteousness so that you are now holy and pure and clean before God. He says, come to me and let Sabbath be your weekly reminder of grace, your circuit breaker from slavery, your gift of rest. Come to me and find your Sabbath and your rest in me. And one day, in eternity, to know the fullness of the rest and the joy that Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath, brings to us. Let's pray.